Okay, it says I'm screen sharing, so I'm assuming that's all good. Yeah. Okay, and yeah, and also I've got a sidebar you often. Hang on, I just want to rearrange that.
Middle way and
It's a bit more
animals.
convenient.
Middle way and animals. The discussion around how we treat animals.
There we go. Right. Okay. So I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I don't actually, to be honest, you probably can't even see my face, which is fine by me because it'll be so minimized, so small. But I've put the little picture of you lot up at the top near the camera, so at least it'll feel like maybe I'm making eye contact with you. Okay, so this evening's talk is The Middle Way in Animals. My name's Jim Champion. I've been a member of the Society for a number of years. And I've lost my thread now. So I'll start again. So this evening's talk is about the middle way and animals. My name's Jim Champion. I've been a member of the Society for a number of years. I'm the secretary as well, so I help out in that way as well. I've done a couple of talks before, but this is the first one for the Middle Way Network. I'm not going to claim any particular authority here either. My day job is a physics teacher in a secondary school, and that's been my career throughout my adult life. Yeah, I'm not claiming to come at this quite in the same way. Let's say last time Hannah was speaking about COVID, you know, I gave her a lot of credit being a doctor talking about that subject, as in a GP. But here I am speaking about middle way animals because I volunteered to. So I'm speaking mainly, you know, from my experience and from my interpretation of how I've interpreted the middle way on animals, and from what I've read about what Robert's written, and how I've, you know, how I have implemented that, or how that's worked for me. Okay, right. So clicking in the right place. The pictures, which I have literally added to this presentation in the last half hour, they've all come from a website of a photographer called Joanne MacArthur. So if you're interested, I was in two minds about pictures for a talk about animals because quite often they're triggering and polarizing. So I've tried to pick things that are suitably innocuous but still representing the subject matter that I want them to. So anyway, if you're interested in the photography, there's a credit on this page, and it's true for all the subsequent pictures you might see. There shouldn't be anything gory or so on, because I appreciate. So I'm remembering back to my childhood and seeing the anti-vivisectionists in the high street in the town where I lived, and you know, pre-internet days, and they would have fairly gory, explicit photos out, trying to make their point. So anyway, I'm not trying to go for that approach in what we're showing today. Right. So that's my introduction. As in, it's me. I don't have any particular authority, but I have volunteered to speak about this subject. And we'll look at the following points that you can hopefully see on the screen, although it is a bit small. So it says the first thing is what absolutisations are there, because in the middle way we're interested in identifying absolutisation and avoiding it as a general principle of making more adequate judgments. Also, what might a middle way look like in some respects for animal ethics? What is different about a middle way approach rather than going for, say, an approach that reacts to whatever seems inadequate about animals and in our society. And I said I'd talk particularly about the idea of adopting a moral principle as a way of trying to take a middle way approach as an individual to issues involving animals. And I'll sum up at the end actually using the chapter summary from Robert's book Migglism about ethical practice. I will say also in the talk, although generally I've titled it animals, and that was the idea, the title we came up with when we were discussing what might be appropriate for ethics talks. I have focused mainly on eating animals and animal products, partly because that's obviously, well, it's my experience and probably yours too. We all eat, whereas we might not all fish or angle or go to zoos or whatever. And the other thing is that actually, I mean, if you consider our relationship with animals, even if it's a distant one, the vast majority of animals that are affected by human behaviour, arguably, are in the fact that we farm them for consumption. So I've picked it. Well, it's an easy thing to latch onto, and it's the one I've chosen to go for. Okay, or not the one exclusively, but mainly. Okay, so I said we'd start with some absolutisations, or dogmas, perhaps another way of looking at it. So sort of polarised assumptions. In this case, we're talking about ethics, and so here we've gone for some moral assumptions. With food, for example, so with eating animals and animal products, that's something that in a society it's assumed, maybe the stereotype of someone in British society where I live will eat meat. So that and that won't be unusual, and it's perhaps increasingly the case that there are people who don't, but that's the default position, if you like. Now, one of our podcast guests from the past that Barry had interviewed, Melanie Joy, I was an American social psychologist and vegan advocate, I think she terms herself. And she's her work has focused, or come up in her work, she's come up with the concept of carnism, the idea that giving a name to the sort of overriding status quo moral assumptions that don't normally get held up as being anything particularly special. The idea is that in naming it and identifying what those moral assumptions are, that gives people a chance to examine it. So, I mean, in the middle way, we're often talking about examining our assumptions, and so through her work, and you can hear more about it if you want on Barry's podcast, or look up her work or whatever. But in that, what was particularly pithy was summing up. I think she called it the 3 N's, but I think someone else added nice when they were doing some research on this. So perhaps you could boil it down to, or people's, when they're pressed, what justification do they have for doing what they do, even though it's something they were brought up to do, and maybe a lot of people don't really give it a second thought. Is this idea that if you eat meat or animal products, that's a natural thing to do, that it's a normal thing to do. Perhaps, I don't know, I don't encounter this quite so much, but there are people who insist it's a necessary thing to do. And the nice thing is really about the sort of taste preferences side of things. So it's certainly from the perspective of Melanie Joy, looking at what she calls carnism, that is it's almost like an unexamined assumptions that people make about eating meat, and because that's something they've always done, and other people do, and it's the culture that they live in, and that's a way of sort of identifying what people might come up with as their sort of primary justifications for what they do. Or if they hear that someone doesn't eat meat, then these are the kind of objections they'd have to the idea of not eating meat. In reaction to that, so we're not just looking at sort of like assumptions on one side, and on the other, sort of in reaction to that, you may have what might be called veganism, for example, although that's not just a diet thing, but here I'm focusing on that. Perhaps quite simply the sort of the moral assumptions on that side are insisting that you negate those things that you come across, so that well, I don't know about how you could argue that it was not normal, because it is very widespread, but you could argue that it was somehow unnatural and unnecessary and not nice. So, I mean, very briefly, what are the problems here? Because I'm not going to sort of go into the details. I'm sure most of you are more than familiar with the ins and outs of these arguments about eating meat or not. But on the left, you've got assumptions that haven't been examined, and if you don't ever consider what the assumptions you're making are, you're not really ever going to be able to sort of overcome any conflict that arises from those things. And on the other side, you've got negation of those things, but quite often in negating that, there's, well, almost always in that there is still conflict. So it could be, for example, someone who's taken on a vegan diet and rejected the sort of the idea of eating meat being natural, normal, necessary, and nice. Yet still they have a desire at some level to eat meat. Maybe it's it's a smell, or because it was such a habit from when they were younger, or maybe there's a particular thing that they like, and it's difficult for them to have given it up. So that there are going to be conflicts there in just insisting on the negation of those things. So of having moral assumptions that certainly are counter to something that is very widespread. Okay, the second absolutisation that I wanted to mention is this one about a sort of a relativism and an absolutism. So I think I'm like 43, nearly 44 now. In my life, I think this has come about a bit more of the idea that sort of generally in society, people have got this idea as vegan and vegetarian and alternative sort of to the status quo type of diet things are becoming more widespread in terms of what you can buy in supermarkets, what you can get in cafes and restaurants and so on. There's this idea which obviously suits people who don't want to think too hard about the ethics of eating meat, for example, or eggs or dairy or fish, is that it's an individual choice thing. So we've got this moral relativism of, well, you know, I've made my decision to eat this kind of diet, and I say I'm happy with that, and you say, well, no, you're only going to eat those things. Well, okay, that's, you know, you're happy to choose that, and so it's a sort of, that's an absolute in terms of relativism, that, you know, it's fine for me, but it, you know, you're free to choose what you want. Maybe, or what I think would be the sort of an opposite absolutisation is to go for a moral absolutism, which is perhaps the traditional view of what sort of a radical vegan character would say, which is not that it's fine for them to eat, it's fine for everyone else to eat meat, but, you know, they say it's absolutely wrong. It's the idea that it is a moral absolute, that it's wrong for anyone to eat meat, and they're right in the sense that they've say given it up and vowed never to touch it, and that everyone else or other people are wrong. Again, you can hopefully appreciate the pitfalls of either of these extreme positions. One being for the status quo type argument of you know, everyone can do what they choose to do, is that this idea, well, as is pointed out quite often by people who are on taking the alternative approach, vegetarians or vegans, is that you know, individual humans might be free to choose largely what they eat, but you know, the animals involved don't get much of a choice in this. So it starts to bring in a sort of a wider awareness of the conditions there, that in what sense is it an individual choice if it is involving other sentient things. The on the moral absolutism side, I mean, you've got the sort of almost like the obsession with purity and the fact that it might not be sustainable. I'm sure you know, or maybe this applies to you. Maybe you have at times, for ethical reasons, abstained from eating various things and not managed to sustain that for a long time. And there may, while you were doing it, be you know, if you're going at it from a, you know, sort of all meat is murder kind of approach, that you know, there's a purity thing there, and maybe if you fall off the wagon once, that's it. So it can be a very fragile thing, which is one of the problems associated with absolutisations, that they're quite fragile, easily broken, and, well, you know, you may not end up in a better place, that which is what you were hoping to do through you know, adopting some, maybe reacting to this status quo. Sorry, the picture in the corner, that one, Billingsgate Market, is a, you know, big fish market in London, and we've got there a protester speaking to a crowd of assembled protesters about the whatever it is they're protesting, something to do with the basically that they would be representing a fairly strong position of it's wrong for anyone, and they're trying to disrupt the sort of the normal distribution of fish from that market there. Okay, and the third and final one I'm going to bring up now is this fairly legalistic set of moral assumptions, or contrasting pair of moral assumptions. I mention it because I can't remember how I came across it, but I came across this approach to animal rights ethics called the abolitionist approach. So obviously that is by analogy with the abolition of slavery, of human slavery, and the idea here is, and this is well, it's probably quite rightly viewed as an extreme animal rights view, is that animals are not property, and therefore all things that humans are currently doing with animals that are relying on the fact that we can treat them like property. Their idea is that needs to go, and there's certainly, if you're taking that kind of view, you're not. But basically, their position is characterized by not accepting, for example, animal welfare arguments. They'll say that it's a waste of time concentrating on animal welfare. You should be going for, the full animals need to be liberated or set free. I mean, I'm not talking about literally set free, although some may say that. But the idea is that humans don't continue to use animals as if they're property. So sorry, I had some examples, but no, they apply to the next thing. But anyway, I'm sure I don't need to give examples. I'm sure you can work out. A picture on this one is a greyhound trainer, as in greyhound racing, and there's a greyhound there with his trainer. But perhaps this is where we go maybe a bit wider than thinking about animals as food, although obviously farmed animals are treated to some extent as property. But also the sort of the considerations that are involved in owning pets. We use that phrase. I mean, maybe the phrase companion animals has become more fashionable, but we still talk about owning pets, and there's an idea of ownership and property there. But then there's also animals that are used for entertainment, which is essentially what greyhound racing is, or sport. Sorry. So that was the third one, sort of a legalistic pair of assumptions that get applied. Maybe when we talk about the law, the idea that we don't argue that all animals are human property, or that they're property in some specific kind of category. And some countries, I was just checking this afternoon, some countries do have, or different countries have different levels of legal personhood, I suppose, for want of a better phrase, or lack of property, lack of being property in their constitutions or in their laws. But anyway, those are the three that I wanted to mention to maybe that'll feed into your discussions later. So in terms of what might a middle way look like, if we the phrasing here I've taken from Robert's book. I don't think it was from Migglism. I think it was from one of his earlier books about it was the so-called New Buddhist Ethics, although as he points out, it doesn't have to. It's not solely for Buddhists. It's a book about the middle way, basically. So what I've done is on either side, I've put a sort of a pair of absolutes in terms of attitudes or beliefs about animals. So on the left, we've got that animals are not sentient, or that if they are sentient, it's not relevant to our moral consideration of the ethics of animals. On the right, we've got the idea that animal sentience is equivalent to that of humans. So we're talking about like non-human people, for example. The one on the right, you could consider that would be a sort of a very extreme animal rights position, for example. On the other hand, it quite often applies to sort of the average person as well, sort of the pet owning person who has a very close relationship with their dog, and that it can get very sentimental, or they can certainly put on that animal or ascribe to that animal a level of sentience that maybe it doesn't have. So in the middle, I'm trying to avoid absolutisation with these particular absolutes on either side. We've got the idea that what we're aiming to do is, first one is respond flexibly to the level of experience that's occurring. So we don't know what level of sentience an animal has, but we can do our best to be as objective as possible. Maybe you do sort of have a hierarchy that's hopefully based on more than just your own whim about the level of sentience in animals. And we certainly in law treat dogs, for example, very differently to the way we treat spiders, for example. We're also in a middle way trying to identify with animals, which is what the sort of the right hand absolute has done, but to an extreme. but not necessarily assuming we feel as we do. We're recognizing that there are differences, and those differences make a difference to the ethics. I'm not quite sure if I've got the language right here, but we might think of ourselves sympathizing with animals, so that's sort of an identification alongside them, without assuming that we can empathize with them in the same way that we could empathize, we assume, with another human being. But it's tricky, but we're talking about a messy middle here. And the third thing there is when we say taking into account what they are really like, again, we're being here objective as possible, but accepting that our understanding of what what a certain animal is really like and what its capacity for suffering is. So we're assuming that we're acting on our best understanding of the situation at the time, but that understanding could be wrong. So there's the I could be wrong awareness of fallibility here, and not to cling to a fragile idea like animals are not sentient, because I would imagine that most of us, if we held that position, that that would quite soon be challenged by our experiences involving animals. Perhaps similarly on the other side, the idea that animal senses are equivalent to humans, again, I'd hope fairly quickly have that challenged just by our experience of living in the world and encountering whatever animals of all different kinds, and the fact that we do well when we take into account what their experience is like, we treat different animals, different categories of animals very differently. Okay, so in terms of taking a middle way approach, I'm kind of sorry, I'm going to use my notes a little bit more here. So I've put some suggestions here, 4 bullet points up, about how taking a middle way approach is different. And when I say different, I mean different to either just sort of going with the status quo of not really examining the moral assumptions that predominate or that underlie the sort of the predominant culture that we live in, or going to the other extreme of negating those, or taking an extreme animal rights approach, or an extreme vegan, let's say, approach to sort of reacting against those the moral status quo. So in the middle way, what we're doing is we're recognizing that the moral decisions we're making are not just abstracted ideas about animals and what they are really like. So the first point I've made is it's about us and them. So the ethics of animals is not something that we sort of abstract out about something that's out there. It's about us and the animals. It's about what we are like too, and the conditions we live in. I've said it. It starts from where we are now, not some idealized other place, and that means we need to face up to well, I'll say it, but I think it faces up to the reality that we can't currently live, and a lot of people wouldn't be able to prosper, farming that involves animals, for example, without using animals. And so we need to recognise that that's the starting place we're in, and also the fact that we'll all be in a different place. I mean, if I, as I did at some point, made a decision to not eat meat anymore, that's going to involve a different set of challenges to if I am let's say, a dairy farmer or a beef farmer, who, for whatever reason, has made the same decision. It's going to have an impact on, much bigger impact on their life. So, those differences in where we're starting from are something that has to be taken account of. It's also not really possible. It's sort of on that related idea, to justify, for example, saying we should ban all sale of meat from tomorrow, because it's going to require a massive psychological change. So it's about recognizing that we if it's unsustainable, if it creates a backlash, then it's not going to actually end up leading to long-term progress. So it's not about, I think it's presented maybe from a sort of an extreme vegan perspective of, about no, everything needs to stop now. It should, but and you're making excuses or excusing unethical behavior, in this case, say eating meat, But the idea is that we've got to recognise that different people are in different positions. The status quo is very entrenched, and it's something that is going to need a more incremental approach, or at least that's one of the ways of looking at. Excuse me. The middle way approach is one of the signs is incrementalism. So this ethical practice that we're doing, it's not an abstracted right thing, but we're moving forward, and by forward we're talking about integrating ourselves more, and in that sense I'm talking about, in this case, reducing conflict between desires we have or beliefs we have. It's got to be realistic, because if we stretch ourselves, if we push ourselves too far beyond what we currently do, again it's going to cause a reaction. So, and I'm sure you've got your own examples of that from whatever area of trying to change habits, for example. So there's an idea that there's in the middle way we're trying to achieve a balance. So it's not about saying, well, on Monday I shall eat meat and on Tuesday I shall not, and then Wednesday I will again, and then Thursday, and sort of literally having sort of some kind of golden mean in that sense. But it's about a balance. Well, I've put it here as between moral challenge and realism. We're stretching ourselves in a way that it matches our capacity to actually change, but not just sitting back and saying, I don't need to do anything. If there is some kind of conflict going on that needs a resolution, but that needs work on, a clash of different desires, for example, then we're going to have to work on it, but we're going to have to work in a way that's realistic and sustainable. Otherwise, we might not need to ever have begun. So the last part I wanted to talk about is about adopting a principle. I've got some suggestions of what I mean by principle, but I can give you an easy example. At some point, I adopted the principle: I will not eat meat. I will eat like a vegetarian does. For me, at the time, it was actually a relatively easy thing to adopt. I'm not going to say anything more about it now because it take too long, but I did write a blog post about this a few years back, and I've linked it from the page about today's talk. And there was a conflict of desires in the background. At the stage where I made this decision, I was, if you like, morally uncomfortable with the idea that by eating meat, I was supporting the meat farming industry, which for various reasons I wasn't comfortable doing that. It was a clash of desires. That on the one hand, there was the desire for just doing what I was always already doing, as in occasionally eating meat, enjoying the taste of it, and so on, doing something that was sort of socially acceptable. So there was that side of it versus the conflict against the idea that it felt like the wrong thing to be doing. Again, so like I say, it wasn't hard for me to make that adopt that principle, if you like, and I stuck to it fairly well. But when I took that on, it gave me a framework for making decisions. So in that sense, it was a useful shortcut. So I didn't have to, every time it came to making a choice about what was I about to eat, I didn't have to then argue through the pros and cons and so on every time, because I had this this fairly simple reminder in terms of the principle of not eating meat. I mean, it might sound obvious, but that's what it was. It was something that made it easy for me to decide, because it would remind me that I'd made that sort of that promise to myself, if you like. Importantly, though, in a middle way sense, is that the principle itself is not of itself of final moral importance. The moral importance is in the the thing that I'm aspiring to, and being able to justify why I'm doing that. The principle itself is there as a guidance to myself, and like I said, it was a useful shortcut as well. And one way I hadn't thought about it before, but this was obvious from something I read in Migglism, is that a principle is a good guard against rationalizing exceptions. So when I'm not feeling so strong or able to sort of maintain the moral sort of expectations I've set for myself, having the principle of thinking, well, you've got this principle of not eating meat. It can help to stop easily rationalizing what might accept. Saying, well, on this case, oh, never mind, whatever. It's well, we all know, and other people can hold. So we've talked before about feeling responsible and being held responsible. If you've shared your principle with other people, then it's a way of them actually holding you responsible, and hopefully, you'll appreciate that support in terms of habit change from having a principle that other people are aware of too. And the final point I've said there is I mean, you can obviously have principles that can be held dogmatically and so on. But the idea is it's held provisionally, not so that we can be a bit weak and wishy-washy, but for the fact that, as argued elsewhere in middle way philosophy, we might be wrong. We've got to be aware of our fallibility. On the other hand, it might be that the principle was good for a set of conditions when we set it, but maybe the conditions have changed. So maybe what's gone on around us. Sorry, the daft example that pops to head is, what if I was washed up on a desert island and there was nothing to eat but eggs or something? I mean, that's a daft example, but conditions can change in a more subtle way, and it may be that I need to re-examine what the principle is, and what were the assumptions behind the principle and why I chose it. Okay. So I was going to mention eggs as well, but I'm going to skip that as well. There were lots of pictures of eggs. So in both of these examples, and this is something that Robert pointed out in Migglism, talking about his own sort of journey with being vegetarian and later deciding to eat a vegan diet, is that the actions that I've chosen to take in setting these principles are a moral practice. So it's a practical thing, it's a pragmatic thing, but they're a practice because they require a kind of moral effort, because you're doing something that's contrary to what's going on around you in your society or in your the community that you're in. So if I continue to eat meat, or later on if I'd continue to eat eggs routinely, it wouldn't really have required any moral effort, because I would just be carrying on doing what I was doing anyway, and doing the same thing as the people either side of me, generally speaking. So it's a moral practice in that it requires an effort. So there is a difference there between that and just carrying on to do what you were doing anyway, and not examining the assumptions. And again, our sort of approach in middle way philosophy is that examining your assumptions is the way, or is one of the ways to start going about further integration or reducing conflict. The other thing about principle held provisionally, the idea that it might be wrong, or that conditions might change, is that like I've already said this, that conditions may change, and we need to make sure that we're holding the principle in a way that we could make a change if we needed to be, and not carry on. It's an awful metaphor to use in this context, but carry on flogging a dead horse. Yeah, okay, maybe it's a completely appropriate one for this talk. The principle that I have now, which is, I mean, I don't eat eggs, or my principle is to avoid eating eggs. It would seem wrong stream to a mainstream carnist, if you like, someone who perhaps status quo just thinks that eating eggs is natural, normal, and necessary thing that you do. But it would also seem wrong to a strict vegan, because they would just their view would be animal products are not permitted; they're not something you eat. So I mean, or on the other hand, maybe an animal rights activist who's one of the coming from the abolitionist point of view, that eating eggs is theft. So my intention is, I don't want to support the egg industry for ethical reasons, based on the suffering of the animals involved. But I do need to hold it lightly enough that if I do eat something that contains egg, or if I, for whatever reason, decide that I'm going to eat something knowingly, or just to eat an egg, for example, that it's not going to lead to such a strong reaction. I give up the principle entirely, because it is something that has value to me, and I think it's worth persisting with. But I don't want it to be so fragile that one exception, one transgression, if you like, or one situation where I had to do it for whatever reason, whether that was just social reasons or whether it was physical necessity to keep myself alive. Yeah, I'm going to come up against my assumptions, hopefully, if that's the case. And hopefully I would be able to examine them. And it's a practice in that you keep doing it and you keep learning about it as well. So the summary, like I said, I've taken this from Migglism, from the ethical practice section, which isn't exclusively about whether or not one thinks it's the right thing to do to eat meat or not. But obviously these things apply in this situation. So we use this term integration in middle way philosophy, and we talk about one of the sort of the positive side of the middle way. It's not just about avoiding absolutes, it's about becoming more integrated. And the point here is we're talking about reducing the conflict between desires, so or beliefs even. So this is why an ethical practice, it has that effect of reducing conflict. So it's an integrative practice. It also means it's going to require some work. So like I say, if the assumption is that that people eat meat, then it's going to require work to have to challenge that assumption and to go out of your way, not just go with the flow. So it's an ethical practice that it will require work, like any practice is going to do. I haven't said anything here about sort of advocacy or arguing with people. I'm sure that will come up if you're discussing these points later. But yeah, it's how you go about challenging moral assumptions and habits of your community is, it's another thing again. But it's inevitably going to be involved, except in the most sort of unusual kind of circumstances. Third thing is that, like I've mentioned about earlier, it could be something as simple as having a principle, and it's for various reasons I've said it's that's a useful thing to have rather than but it must be held relatively lightly, so provisionally, and we must have an awareness of the fact we could be wrong in what we're doing, and so balance is required in applying this principle appropriately. We don't want to slip into sort of holding it dogmatically, because then we're laying ourselves or setting ourselves up for the kind of pitfalls of living in absolutisation. And the final point is that a balance is required, and that, like I said, that doesn't mean some kind of 50-50 between of the two absolutes and just flipping back and forth between them. But in this case, talking about a balance between what we're capable of, capability for sustained change. So we've got the moral challenge of, we think it would be better if we lived a particular way, but we need to balance that with our capability for sustained change, and that is going to vary widely between people, and we shouldn't be letting people off the hook, I suppose, if they're capable of stretching themselves more and they claim to want that. But on the other hand, there's issues around how hard we push ourselves, how hard we push others, and how much effort are we willing to make to work at that ethical practice, because it is something that requires work. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation anyway. Usual practice now is to turn over to questions or comments from people before we split into groups.
Okay, thanks very much, Jim, for that. So shall we have like 10 minutes of questions? I know we're running a bit later than usual, but is everyone okay with that? Yeah. So 10 minutes of questions, and we'll at least have some time for a group discussion. Could I plunge in with the first one?
Yeah.
So I've got a thought for you, Jim. Yeah, you were talking about where we are now and working realistically with what we can manage.
Yeah.
And I wondered, but one thing you didn't mention was the role of ecological conditions, and certainly in my mind that plays a big role in the reason why I'm adhered largely to the principle of veganism. So I wonder how that figures in your thinking. How do you take into account ecological conditions?
Yeah, it wasn't something that let's say when I was younger and I first had a adopted a principle of not eating meat. It didn't particularly feature particularly highly there. It was, I mean, it was as complicated as it is for everyone. But what's been quite surprising more recently is I've met more people who, you know, when you're finding out, meeting new people and finding things out about them, that they do say that they, you know, you find that they too don't eat meat. And it has been quite surprising to me. I don't know why, but that people are doing it for that reason. For sort of, they say, well, it's because of climate change. And it's, yeah, so it's maybe that's a new angle on it that wasn't present, say, 20, 30 years ago when I was first thinking about this. That makes it more of a, yeah, like I say, more of a, we ought to be making more of an effort to go that way. It's a point, like I say, it's a, when I said about sort of groups of more extreme animal rights, say, you know, it's controversial there whether, you know, they're sort of basically arguing amongst themselves about the best way to try and sell this idea to other people, because there'll be some who are very attached to the, it's all about the ethical side of things. It's about the reducing suffering kind of, you know, animal suffering side of thing, and you shouldn't dilute that with other arguments. I mean, hopefully a middle way approach would say that we need to recognise and understand, you know, and find out more about what advantage there is in eating a different way for the sake of, I mean, people obviously, sort of the general public are quite open to messages about health, let's say, more so it seems their own personal health. And so messages about eating and diet in relation to health, although, I mean, various messages seem to be hard to get through, and change is hard for all sorts of reasons for people. But okay, I work with young people as in teenagers, and they seem more aware of the idea that food choices are also climate change issues, as well as being either some kind of weird personal choice or some kind of, you know, you're soft about animals or whatever it is, or but they are more aware of it than certainly I ever was when I was, you know, 25 years ago, when I was in the same age range as them.
Okay. Any other questions? Anybody else?
Question?
Sorry.
Yeah. Again, question to Jim. How do you feel about the rise of what should I call it? Flexitarianism. The fact that lots more people these days are reducing their meat intake, and so you know, they'll often go to a vegetarian restaurant not because they're vegetarians, but for a change, like, you know, like also the vegetarian fare in itself has improved drastically over the last 10, 15 years. But also in relation to Robert, people have become a lot more aware of the fact of the impact of the environmental issues with it. So do you think this trend, because it certainly is a trend, in some ways reflects a middle way, a larger sense of, you know, a proportionality there?
It's certainly in terms of awareness of alternatives, for sure. And I mean, you go to, sorry, not right now maybe, but you go to pubs or restaurants and things, and you know, would you like to see the vegan menu? I was surprised to see on the bottom of the regular menu, or turnover for our you know, vegetarian and vegan options. As in that it has become more mainstream in those kind of situations. One of the things I'm worried about with that is the argument. I mean, for example, so a few years ago now, watching things like, you know, like Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall on the TV, and he was trying to get the people. It was in Axminster, which is somewhere I vaguely know, and he was you know, outside Tesco trying to persuade people that they ought to spend a bit more in order to buy chickens that weren't produced in such horrendous conditions as the very cheapest chickens in supermarkets like Tesco are. You know, and quite quickly he had people who basically were living on very little money telling him, look, the cold hard fact is, you know, we've always eaten this way, we can afford to eat this way, and you know, and go back to your like posh country cottage and leave us alone. And I mean, he changed tack, obviously, a sort of campaign on other issues after that, but there is that side of it that I appreciate in my sort of comfortable world of being able to having enough money to be able to choose what I spend it on. It's again, that's another thing that makes it relatively easy for me to eat the way I do. But there is that consideration that food. Well, it's two things. One, that the meat is incredibly cheap, relatively speaking, and secondly, the cheaper the meat, generally, the worse the ecological and the sort of animal suffering type considerations are. So, I welcome the changes, but I appreciate that they might be for the more better off of us, which presumably includes us here. But it might not be such an easy choice for people to make who don't have, who aren't as well off as us.
Yeah, no, good point.
Oh, hi, Julian.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for that. That was great. It was really good. Yeah, it's just always good to be challenged about anything, really. And I wonder, something that's coming up for me is then the political challenge as well as the personal consumer challenge.
Yeah.
Because one of the things you were talking about there is the thing that Hugh Fernie-Whittenstall was coming up against is that people don't have money it's expensive to eat morally well. And so it's a political issue. We've got a system that subsidizes cheap, food. All the kind of financial incentives are in the wrong place. So is it enough to just change your own personal lifestyle, or
yeah, it's
more helpful for us? How much energy should be splitting between political action and personal change?
It's one of those areas where I'm not sure where I'd even begin with it, and certainly as I'm going off at a slight tangent, but for example, my dad lives in Vietnam and has done for a long time, and there, if you don't eat meat, it's a status thing that says that you're too poor to afford the meat. So a lot of countries, a lot of cultures around the world, it's been that meat requiring more resources or whatever has tended to be something that is only available for people who can afford it. So as in contrast that with the situation we have now, where actually it's almost ludicrously cheap to buy meat of some kind, even if it's the very sort of dodgiest chicken or sausages or whatever that are available from sort of supermarkets value sections. So I do know what you mean, and that I don't know. It's things like free range eggs, right? Then that's a step in the right direction, even if it's if it's turned out to be not quite such a great step as it initially seemed, maybe. But that's something that's almost across the board, certainly in this country, has changed over the past however many years, and that presumably required lobbying and pressure to get the political cogs turning in order to make that a reality. That so, for example, like battery chicken thing, is I don't know. I sometimes, often, if you read books about this, they're by US authors, and the situation in the US is very different to the UK in terms of cheapness of food and the conditions in which it's produced, and so on, and what they outsource it to as well. So that website that I got the images from, a lot of the images, the more gory ones, let's say, or the more upsetting ones, if to most people, are taken in Mexico, where America imports a lot of food from there, and they're not held to the same standards that they are, even the low standards they have in the US. But I don't even know what to say. It's difficult to know, but it's like you say, individual choices will take you so far. And I've talked about the fact that my principles were based on not wanting to support such industries, but appreciating that I'm a drop in. Obviously, it's one less customer, if you like, but I am a drop in the ocean, and there may be, like you say, it may require some, rather than bottom up change. How do you get the top down change happening as well, which takes you into the political area?
Yeah.
Are there any overall thoughts or questions for Jim, or possibly for me if you prefer, but mainly for Jim? Would you like to come in with some of the interesting things you were saying in our group, Alan?
Oh boy. Some of it might actually be better, like on the site itself, to write it out when you post this, just because I feel like some of the points might be a bit kind of difficult to string together again. I mean, it was more of a stream of thought in some ways, but yeah, one thing I would maybe just say from our conversation that you know, struck me was again our relationships to other beings. Notice I'm refusing in some ways to use the word animals, because as I said in our conversation, I've never experienced animals no more than I've experienced humanity or nature. These are kind of very abstract terms, and we tend to get behind them and act like we know what we're talking about when we discuss them. And something I found in Jim, was that his name?
Yeah.
Sorry, Jim's talk, was there was this interesting play between acknowledging relationships between different beings and then going back into the abstract, particularly when talking about aspects of life like suffering and whatnot. And I brought up in the conversation, that I have fairly close contact with some indigenous people, and they really tend to look at other beings more on their own terms rather than using an abstraction like animals. And how do I adopt my life? And I would use the word posture rather than position. How do I posture my ethical stance or my life toward these particular beings rather than a grand idea of animals or suffering? And some of these animals, some of these beings are actually part of the tribe or the people. And I've read that in a lot of accounts, particularly the ones I've read in South America, where there are certain beings, plants included, that have personhood, that are persons. They don't have it, they are persons. And some are not. And this play that they tend to, they've hammered out over long periods of time in, I would use the word loosely, sustainable way, is, I think, worthy of our concern. And I find a lot of these debates really, this really strong undercurrent of we are European descent, but Eurocentrism with our broad categories and whatnot, and not really looking into the way these peoples relate in their everyday lives to these other beings. One great book I would recommend is called Beyond Nature and Culture by Philip Discola. I think it's a great book. He's talks a lot about the difference in anthropology itself, this whole notion that took place between nature and culture. Well, there are no words for nature in a lot of these people. They don't have a word for it. And so they're, as you would say, very provisional in their relationships because they change. And they've had to change over time. And they don't have a stance toward animals. Anyway, that was part of what came up in our discussion. I don't want to take up, the entire discussion with my perspective. So I don't know. I would love to hear a response, or if that made any sense to you at all. Thank you.
It partly relates to such things that came up in when we were talking about our being humans in this sort of Western something, our distance from let's say animals that we end up eating or whatever. And that isn't something. I mean, I read a book at Christmas by John Seamer, the self-sufficiency guy from the sort of the 1950s, and where he described in detail sort of his life when he first went, and how they ended up raising pigs and so on their small holding. And it was a completely different. He was talking about how it was a completely different way of relating to his food, his sort of animal food, if you like, than even people at the time in the 1950s. So I mean, even more distance has opened up, I think, since then, between people and the animals and so on that they eat. But he had a very particular view on it. But it was when he talked about how it would have been more common in the past, as in hundreds of years ago, but sort of living in close proximity to the food. But it sounds like the description you're talking about, sort of like the being part of the tribe, was very different. That John Seymour still saw them as food producing units, as in food for him and his family. He didn't have that sort of, well, he had still had a very Western, I suppose, way of relating to the animals, even though he sort of was living very intimately with them. They weren't quite living in the house with him, but they almost. But yeah, no, I'm as much a part of my culture as anyone else. So yeah, even when examining my assumptions, I'm already starting on that particular platform and looking at it with the eyes that I've inherited.
Okay, maybe we could just try and fit in one more thought or question or something. Is there anything particular in your group, Jim, that might be good to share?
We were talking about again about the affordability of food and how the pricing certainly doesn't respect sort of the way in which the food is being produced and so on. And it's going to be, well, it's the fact that maybe there's like a sort of moral case on all sorts of grounds, like you say, like environmental grounds and so on. That was one thing that came up again, and also the issue of food waste, which just towards the end, which I mean that's a complicated area, but if a very significant proportion of the animals that have lived and died to feed us are actually ended up not, I mean, is there a moral case for improving efficiency if you're not committed to completely sort of eradicating the use of animals for food? Then what role does that, and who's going to actually want, who will benefit from that, and who won't? And again, it's possibly a fallout of the fact that if food wasn't so cheap, there wouldn't be such a lot of wastage. It's quite a tangled. It's everything. It's politics. It's economics. It's people's. It's sort of religious and cultural. It's everything gets mixed up in this, and it's a very tangled topic.
Yeah, which is probably precisely why you can sincerely try to apply the middle way and end up with very different positions. So that's probably one thing to sort of emphasize in closing. I think that obviously there have been different positions articulated here, but not hugely apart, I don't think, but people will reach different judgments based in different circumstances and different cultural positions and individual experience. Okay,